Late at night, the top floor of Sterling Tower looked almost unreal. Houston stretched beneath the bedroom windows in gold and white. Headlights crawled through downtown. Rain slid down the glass in thin, crooked lines, turning the whole city soft and blurry. Victoria stood barefoot in front of the window, with one hand resting over the small curve of her stomach. 3 months. 3 months pregnant, and nobody knew except her doctor. And Graham. She closed her eyes for a moment. 3 months, and somehow she had never felt more alone. The bedroom door opened behind her. Graham walked in without a word. His tie hung loose around his neck. His white shirt was wrinkled near the collar. He smelled like expensive perfume that did not belong in their home. He never looked at her. He tossed his phone onto the bed, loosened his cuffs, and headed toward the closet like she was part of the room, like she had been standing there all night waiting to disappear. Victoria swallowed. "You missed dinner again." "I had meetings." His voice was cold, flat, the kind of voice that made strangers think he was important and made wives realize they were no longer loved. Victoria turned slowly. "You said that yesterday." "I had meetings yesterday, too." He loosened his tie. That was when she saw it. A faint pink mark on the inside of his collar. Lipstick. Not enough for him to notice. Enough for her to know. Victoria stared at it without moving. The worst part was not that another woman had touched him. The worst part was that Graham no longer cared if she saw it. For a second, she could not breathe. This was the same man who once drove across Houston in the middle of a thunderstorm because she said she wanted peach cobbler from that little soul food place near 3rd Ward. The same man who used to pull her into the kitchen at midnight and dance with her in his socks while old music played from somebody's phone. The same man who used to look at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Now he looked annoyed that she was still standing there. If you have ever loved somebody who slowly turned into a stranger, take a second to like this video and tell me in the comments when you first knew something was wrong, because Victoria was about to find out the truth in the worst possible way. Graham reached for his jacket. His phone lit up on the bed. Victoria looked down without meaning to. One message. One name. Can't stop thinking about tonight. Vanessa. The room went silent. Graham saw it a second too late. He grabbed the phone off the bed, but his face had already changed. Victoria looked at him, then at the phone, then back at him. Her fingers moved across her stomach without thinking. Who is Vanessa? Welcome to Mr. Kingswell's Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're glad to have you. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And before we continue, comment the time and where you are watching this story from. Graham looked at her for a long second after she asked the question. Who is Vanessa? Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows. The city below kept moving like nothing had happened. Cars still crossed downtown. Somewhere below the tower, music drifted up from a rooftop bar. Houston did not stop for broken hearts. Graham slid his phone into his pocket. You went through my phone? Victoria stared at him. That's your answer? He gave a tired sigh and walked toward the dresser. I'm not doing this tonight. The words hit harder than they should have. Because once, years ago, there had never been a night Graham would not have done this for her. There had been nights when they stayed awake until 2 a.m, sitting on the kitchen floor, eating takeout from paper containers because they were too exhausted to make real food. There had been nights when Sterling Global was barely surviving, and they sat together at the dining room table surrounded by papers, contracts, coffee cups, and fear. Back then, Graham used to look at her like they were a team. Now, he would not even answer a simple question. Victoria wrapped both arms around herself. Is she one of your meetings? He stopped, only for a second. That second told her everything. Victoria, he said quietly, I'm tired. No, she whispered. You're guilty. He turned around sharply. You want to know what's exhausting? Coming home every night and being interrogated. She almost laughed. Interrogated, as if she was the problem, as if she had done something wrong by noticing her husband smelled like another woman. Victoria looked down at the floor for a moment because she could feel tears pressing behind her eyes, and she refused to let him see them. Not tonight. She had spent too many months pretending not to notice the changes, the late nights, the canceled dinners, the way he no longer touched her unless somebody was watching. Even his voice had changed. There was a time Graham used to come home and pull her into his arms before he even took off his shoes. There was a time he would stop in the doorway and smile when he saw her standing in the kitchen. One night, years ago, the power had gone out during a storm. They had been living in their first apartment. Tiny kitchen, cheap cabinets, no air conditioning. Victoria remembered standing by the stove, fanning herself with a magazine while Graham searched for candles. When he found one, he set it on the counter, looked at her, and held out his hand. "What are you doing?" she had asked, laughing. "Dancing with my wife. There's no music, so sing something." She did. Badly. He danced with her anyway, barefoot in that tiny kitchen with rain hitting the windows and the whole room lit by one candle. Victoria closed her eyes for half a second. That man felt farther away than the city below them. "You still haven't answered me," she said. Graham loosened his jaw. "She works with a client." "Do you hear yourself? What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you couldn't even come up with a better lie." His face hardened. For a moment, he looked less like the man she married, and more like a stranger who happened to know where her towels were kept. Victoria turned away from him and walked slowly back toward the window. Her hand rested over her stomach again. 3 months. The words sat quietly inside her. 3 months pregnant. She had imagined telling him 100 different ways. She thought maybe she would leave the sonogram on his desk, or hand him a tiny pair of shoes wrapped in a box. She used to imagine him smiling, picking her up, kissing her forehead. Now she was not even sure he would look up from his phone. Behind her, Graham took off his watch and set it on the dresser. "I have an early morning," he said. Victoria turned around slowly. "You forgot something." "What?" "My appointment." His expression did not change. "You had an appointment?" She stared at him. "The doctor." Silence. "You promised you'd come." "I had a meeting." The same answer, every time. Victoria nodded slowly, because suddenly she understood something she had not wanted to understand before. It was not that Graham was busy. It was that Graham no longer cared. The truth hurt, because it was simple. He still had time for whoever Vanessa was, just not for her. She walked past him toward the bathroom. When she reached the doorway, he spoke again. "You're being dramatic." Victoria stopped with her back to him. Maybe once that word would have broken her. Tonight, it only made her tired. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I think the saddest part is that you still believe I don't notice." He said nothing. For the first time all night, Graham looked uncomfortable. Victoria stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. She leaned both hands against the sink and stared at herself in the mirror. She looked the same face, same dark curls, same tired eyes. But something inside her had changed. A woman can spend years loving somebody, years making excuses, years convincing herself that if she gives enough, waits long enough, forgives enough, things will go back to the way they were. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes the person you love leaves long before they walk out the door. Later that night, Graham fell asleep beside her, or pretended to. Victoria lay on her back staring at the ceiling while the city lights moved across the room. He was only inches away, but she had never felt more alone. Beside her, Graham slept peacefully. Victoria turned her face toward the dark and finally let herself admit the truth. She was mourning a man who was still alive. The next morning, Graham left before sunrise. Victoria heard him moving around the bedroom in the dark, the sound of drawers opening, hangers sliding across the closet rod, his phone vibrating once against the nightstand. He never kissed her goodbye. By the time she came downstairs, his coffee cup sat in the sink, and the house was quiet again. Victoria stood in the kitchen for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. Then she opened the refrigerator. If Graham was going to lie, she was tired of helping him do it. Still, by noon, she found herself standing in the kitchen, packing his lunch. Fried catfish, greens, cornbread, food from the little restaurant her aunt used to take her to every Sunday after church. The same lunch Graham used to ask for when he had a hard day. She almost left it sitting on the counter. Almost. Instead, she placed the containers carefully into a bag, picked up her purse and drove downtown. Houston traffic moved slowly under a gray sky. The rain from the night before still clung to the streets. Cars crawled past River Oaks. A delivery truck blocked one lane near Main Street. A man in a suit crossed the street holding his jacket over his head. even though it was no longer raining. By the time Victoria pulled into the parking garage at Sterling Global, she already had a strange feeling in her chest. Not fear, something quieter. The feeling you get when part of you already knows the truth and the rest of you is still trying not to. The lobby looked exactly the way it always did. Marble floors, tall glass walls, fresh flowers near the reception desk. Victoria had helped choose every detail when the building was designed. Back then, Graham used to joke that she cared more about the office than he did. Maybe she had. The receptionist looked up and froze, just for a second. "Mrs. Sterling," she said quickly. Victoria smiled politely. "Hi." The receptionist glanced toward the hallway leading to Graham's office. "You should have called first." The words came too fast, too nervous. Victoria tightened her grip on the lunch bag. "I was in the area." "Oh." The receptionist looked down at her computer, even though she was not typing. "Mr. Sterling is busy." Victoria nodded slowly. "Busy with what?" "I think he's in a meeting." "A meeting, of course." Victoria looked at the hallway again, then back at the receptionist. "You know," she said softly, "you've never looked scared to see me before." The receptionist swallowed. For a second, Victoria almost felt sorry for her, because she knew that look. The look people get when they know something ugly and wish they did not. "It's okay," Victoria said gently. "You don't have to say anything." Then she turned and walked down the hallway. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. The closer she got to Graham's office, the quieter everything felt. She passed the framed magazine covers with Graham's face on them. Houston's youngest billionaire, the visionary behind Sterling Global, the king of Houston real estate. Victoria almost laughed, because none of those magazines knew who had really built that company. Halfway down the hall, she heard it. A woman laughing, soft, confident, comfortable, too comfortable. Victoria stopped walking. The conference room door stood slightly open. She could see the edge of the long table, the corner of Graham's shoulder. Then the woman stepped closer. Blonde, cream dress, one hand on Graham's tie. Victoria could not move. The woman smiled up at him. "You work too hard," she said. Graham smiled back, not his business smile, not the one he used at charity dinners or interviews. The real one, the one Victoria had not seen in months. For 1 second, her chest hurt so badly she thought she might fall. The woman straightened his tie, then she kissed him, and Graham kissed her back, like it was easy, like it was familiar, like it had happened before. Victoria stood there, without breathing. The bag slipped in her hand. Warm grease soaked through the bottom and onto her fingers. Neither of them noticed her. Neither of them even looked toward the door, because people stop being careful when they stop caring who they hurt. Victoria stepped backward. One step, then another. The hallway seemed longer now. The elevator took forever. By the time the doors closed, her hands were shaking. She looked down at the bag. The cornbread had tipped sideways. The container of greens had burst open. A dark stain spread slowly across the paper. She stared at it all the way down to the parking garage. When she finally reached her car, she climbed inside and locked the doors. For a few seconds, she just sat there. Then she broke. Not the kind of crying people do in movies. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep, it feels like your chest is tearing apart from the inside. She bent forward over the steering wheel and cried until she could not breathe. Cried for the man Graham used to be. Cried for the marriage she had been trying to save by herself. Cried because she was pregnant and alone, and sitting in a parking garage, holding a ruined lunch that suddenly felt ridiculous. After a while, the tears slowed. Victoria leaned back against the seat and wiped her face. The parking garage was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Mascara under her eyes. Lipstick faded. Heart broken, but not destroyed. Not yet. Her gaze dropped to the passenger seat, to the lunch bag, then to her phone lying beside it. Slowly, Victoria picked it up. She opened the call history. There were numbers she had ignored before. Late-night calls, private numbers, repeated calls from the same unknown contact. Then she opened the bank app. A transfer from one of the company accounts. $2,000. Then another. Hotel charges in Miami. A jewelry store in River Oaks. A weekend in Aspen. Victoria stared at the screen. The tears disappeared. Little by little, something else took their place. Not rage, clarity. Because suddenly, the pieces fit. The late nights, the missing money, the lies, the perfume. Vanessa. Victoria sat very still. Then she opened another app. A folder. Private. Hidden. Inside were screenshots, copies of statements, photographs, things she had saved because some part of her had known she would need them one day. She had not wanted to believe it before. Now she did. She looked out through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. Then, down at her stomach. 3 months. For the first time since the night before, Victoria did not feel weak. She felt awake. She started the car. Before she drove away, she looked at herself in the mirror one last time and spoke softly. Do not destroy yourself trying to save somebody who already chose to lose you. That night, Victoria cooked dinner anyway. Not because she still believed it would fix anything, because she needed the house to feel normal for one more hour. Soft jazz played low through the speakers in the living room. Candles burned on the dining table. The lights in the kitchen were warm. She wore the dark green dress Graham once said made her look like money and trouble at the same time. 3 months pregnant, exhausted, heartbroken, and somehow still standing. Outside, Houston glowed beyond the windows. Inside, the food slowly grew cold. By the time Graham came home, it was after 10. He walked through the front door, loosening his tie. Different tie tonight. Victoria noticed that immediately. He stopped when he saw the candles. The hell is this? Dinner. I told you I had plans. I know. He frowned at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Graham tossed his keys onto the counter and poured himself a drink. You're doing too much. Victoria looked at him quietly. No, I've been doing too little. He took a sip and leaned back against the counter. I'm not in the mood for another fight. Good, she said. Neither am I. That caught his attention. Victoria pulled out a chair and sat at the table. Sit down. He looked annoyed. Victoria, sit. Something in her voice made him listen. He sat across from her, glass still in his hand. The candles flickered between them. For years, they had eaten at that table together. Some nights laughing, some nights planning, some nights talking about the future like it was something they owned. Tonight, it felt like sitting across from a stranger on a delayed flight. Victoria folded her hands in her lap. I went to your office today. His face changed. Only a little, but she saw it. So I saw her. Silence. Graham looked away first. That hurt more than if he had denied it. Because once, Graham used to fight for them. Now he would not even pretend. She's not important, he said finally. Victoria almost smiled. That must be why you bought her an apartment. His eyes snapped back to her. What? The one near Post Oak. He stared at her. Victoria kept going. The cream-colored couch, the balcony, the expensive wine you never even liked. Victoria, the bracelet from Cartier. He put his glass down too hard. How do you know about that? The weekend in Miami. His face went pale. The hotel in Aspen. Stop. The black car you rented for her in Dallas. I said stop. Victoria looked at him across the table. For the first time in months, Graham looked nervous. Not guilty. Afraid. Good, she thought. He should be. You've been using company money, she said softly. That's none of your business. Victoria laughed. A quiet laugh. The kind that comes when somebody says something so foolish there is nothing else to do. None of my business? He stood up from the table. You've been checking up on me? You made it easy. He ran a hand through his hair. You're acting crazy. No, she said calmly. I'm acting like a woman who got tired of being lied to. He turned away from her. For a second, she saw the exact moment he decided he did not want to feel guilty anymore. People like Graham never stay in the truth for very long. They move the blame somewhere safer. You've changed, he said. Victoria stared at him. I changed? You're always watching me, always asking questions, always making everything difficult. The words sat between them. Heavy, ugly. Victoria felt something inside her go still, because there it was, the lie. Selfish people tell themselves that the person they hurt is the problem for noticing. For a second, she remembered a very different Graham, a younger Graham, A tired Graham sitting across from her at a tiny kitchen table years ago, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. Sterling Global barely existed then. Just an idea. A rented office. Too much debt. Not enough time. Graham had looked defeated that night. "I think I ruined everything," he had said quietly. Victoria remembered reaching across the table and taking his hand. "No," she had told him. "You just need help." He had looked at her then, the way people look at sunlight after too many days of rain. A week later, she sat in her grandfather's old office, holding the papers from his estate. Her grandfather had built everything from almost nothing: real estate, restaurants, beauty supply stores across Texas. He used to tell her that people respected money, but they underestimated quiet people, especially women, especially black women, especially women who let men believe they were in charge. Victoria could still hear his voice. Never let people mistake your kindness for weakness. She had used the money her grandfather left her to save Sterling Global. Not because she wanted control, because she loved Graham. She had met with lawyers, brought in investors, protected the contracts, negotiated every deal when Graham was too exhausted to think straight. At 3 a.m, while Graham slept on the couch in his office, Victoria sat at conference tables and kept his company alive. There had been papers, so many papers. Graham signed most of them without reading, because back then he trusted her. Or maybe he simply never imagined she would be smarter than him. Across the table, Graham was still talking. "You always do this," he said. "You make everything bigger than it needs to be." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood. "You know what's funny?" she asked quietly. "What? You think I'm the one who doesn't understand what's happening?" He frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" Victoria walked past him toward the staircase. Because she knew something Graham had forgotten years ago, something he had signed away when he was desperate and in love and too arrogant to imagine there would ever be consequences. 70%. 70% of Sterling Global belonged to her. The company, the building, the money, the future. It was all sitting quietly in her name. Graham just did not remember. Not yet. Behind her, he spoke again. "You're being dramatic." Victoria stopped halfway up the stairs. Slowly, she turned around. The house was silent. The candles had nearly burned out. Graham stood below her looking irritated, still certain he had power, still certain she would cry and forgive him and stay. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, at the man she once loved. Then she smiled, not because she was happy, because for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid. "You haven't seen dramatic yet." 2 nights after Victoria stood on the staircase and told Graham he had not seen dramatic yet, he brought Vanessa into the house. Victoria heard them before she saw them. The front door opened. Then Vanessa laughed, not a shy laugh, not the kind of laugh a woman gives when she knows she is somewhere she should not be. This laugh was loud, certain, like she had already decided she belonged there. Victoria sat in the living room with a book open in her lap. Though she had not read a single page in almost an hour, she looked up slowly. Vanessa walked into the room wearing a cream sweater and jeans that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over one shoulder. Her lipstick was the same soft pink Victoria had seen on Graham's collar. For one strange second, nobody said anything. Then Vanessa smiled. "Oh," she said, "I didn't realize you were home." Victoria closed the book carefully. "It's my house." Vanessa blinked. Graham stepped in behind her, loosening his tie. "Don't start." Victoria looked at him. "You brought her here. It's not a crime." "No," Victoria said quietly. "Just disrespectful." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You know, Graham told me you were dramatic." Graham did not tell her to stop. That hurt more than Vanessa speaking at all. Victoria stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She walked past both of them toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, she heard Vanessa open the refrigerator, then the sound of a cabinet, then ice dropping into a glass. Victoria stood in the hallway, watching from a distance. Vanessa was drinking sparkling water from one of Victoria's crystal glasses, the expensive ones her aunt gave them as a wedding gift. Vanessa leaned against the counter like she had been living there for years. "You have a beautiful kitchen," she said. Victoria folded her arms. "Yes," she said. "I picked it." Vanessa looked around. "I can tell. It feels traditional." Victoria almost smiled. Vanessa said the word, the way people do when they mean old-fashioned, like warmth and history were something embarrassing. Graham walked into the kitchen and kissed Vanessa lightly on the cheek, right in front of Victoria. Not because he loved Vanessa. Victoria knew that now. He did it because he wanted to hurt her. Because some people cannot stand feeling guilty, so they keep hurting you until you become the villain in their version of the story. Vanessa laughed and leaned against him. "Are we still going to Miami next month?" she asked. Victoria looked down at the folder in her hand. She had been carrying it through the house for an hour. Inside were copies of bank statements, the hotel reservation in Miami, the apartment payments, the jewelry, the charges on company accounts. Vanessa did not even know Victoria already knew. Neither of them did. "Maybe," Graham said. "Maybe." Vanessa pouted. "You promised." "I said maybe." Vanessa rolled her eyes and wandered out of the kitchen. A few minutes later, Victoria heard her upstairs. In the bedroom. Their bedroom. She stood completely still. Graham watched her face. There was something ugly in his expression, something almost satisfied. He wanted her to lose control. He wanted her to scream, to throw something, to cry. That way, he could call her unstable and tell himself he had a reason for what he was doing. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked calmly past him and into the small office off the living room. She shut the door, locked it, and opened her laptop. If Graham wanted to turn the house into a battlefield, she would stop walking onto the field empty-handed. She opened the folder on her computer. Screenshots, photos, statements, a list of dates, a list of purchases, a copy of the apartment lease, a copy of the hotel booking in Aspen. One by one, she added new details. Time Vanessa arrived. What she said, what Graham said, the way he used company money without even trying to hide it anymore. Victoria typed quietly, while the sound of Vanessa's heels moved across the floor above her. Every click of those heels felt like a challenge. Fine, Victoria thought. Challenge accepted. Later that night, the house finally became quiet. Vanessa left around 11. Graham went upstairs without speaking to Victoria. A few minutes later, she heard the shower running. Victoria stepped outside onto the balcony off the bedroom. The air was cool. Houston looked different at night. The city still glittered, but from up there, it looked smaller somehow, less important. The farther she stared, the more she could see the neighborhoods where she grew up, the streets where people sat on porches after dark, the church her grandmother took her to every Sunday, the restaurant where her family crowded around one table after service and stayed too long because nobody ever wanted to leave. Her family had always been loud, loud laughter, loud opinions, too much food, too many people talking at the same time. The women in her family never let each other disappear. Her grandmother especially. She wore bright church hats and perfume that stayed in a room long after she left it. She used to sit at the kitchen table shelling peas and giving advice nobody was brave enough to ignore. A woman can be soft, she used to say, without letting people walk over her. Victoria leaned against the balcony railing. For months, maybe years, she had been begging without saying the word out loud, begging Graham to notice her, begging him to come home, begging him to care, begging him to become the man he used to be. She had called it patience, loyalty, marriage. But standing there in the dark, with one hand resting over her stomach, Victoria finally saw it clearly. She had been shrinking herself to make room for a man who no longer deserved her. Behind her, she heard Graham come out of the bathroom. "Are you coming to bed?" he asked. Victoria looked out across Houston one last time. Then she answered, without turning around, "No." There was a pause. Then silence. Victoria closed her eyes. And somewhere deep inside herself, she made a promise. She would never beg again. 3 days later, Victoria sat alone in the doctor's office again. The waiting room smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. A television in the corner played a daytime talk show with the sound turned too low to understand. Across from her, a young couple sat holding hands while they argued softly over baby names. Victoria looked down at her phone. 11:12 a.m. Her appointment had started 12 minutes ago. Graham was supposed to meet her there. He had promised. That morning, before he left the house, he stood in front of the mirror fixing his tie while Victoria sat on the edge of the bed. "You'll be there this time?" she asked. He sighed without looking at her. "Yes, you said that last time." And I mean it this time. She wanted to believe him. That was the problem. A part of her still wanted to believe him. Now she sat alone in the waiting room watching the minutes pass. 11:19, 11:26. Then finally, her phone buzzed. Victoria looked down. Busy, rain check. That was it. 2 words and a period. No apology, no explanation, just busy, rain check. Victoria stared at the message until the screen went dark. Rain check. As if seeing his unborn child was dinner plans. As if there would always be another chance. Victoria? She looked up. The nurse stood in the doorway smiling gently. Victoria slipped her phone into her purse and stood. The examination room felt too bright. She sat on the edge of the paper-covered table while the nurse checked her blood pressure. "You okay, honey?" the nurse asked softly. Victoria nodded automatically. The nurse looked at the numbers and frowned. "Your pressure's a little high." "I'm fine." The nurse gave her the same look people always give when they know you are lying but decide to let you keep your pride. A few minutes later, the doctor walked in holding her chart. He smiled at first, then he looked at her face. The smile disappeared. "You came alone again." Victoria looked down at her hands. He got busy. The doctor set the chart down. For a second, he said nothing. Then he pulled a chair closer. "You've been under a lot of stress." It was not a question. Victoria stared at the floor. The room suddenly felt too small. "I'm trying not to be, but you are." His voice was gentle. That somehow made it worse. The doctor folded his hands. "The baby is okay." Victoria let out a breath. She did not realize she had been holding. "But your blood pressure is getting higher every time I see you." Her chest tightened again. "You need rest," he said. "You need support. You need peace." Victoria almost laughed. Peace. That felt like something that happened to other women. Women with husbands who held their hands in waiting rooms. Women who did not go home every night to a house that felt colder than the street outside. The doctor looked directly at her. "If this continues, you could lose the pregnancy." The words hit her so hard she forgot to breathe. Lose the pregnancy. Lose the baby. For 1 second, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. "No," she whispered. "You need to take this seriously." Victoria nodded slowly. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain started halfway down the freeway. Not heavy, just enough to blur the windshield and slow traffic to a crawl. Cars filled every lane. Brake lights glowed red ahead of her. Houston always looked lonelier in the rain. Victoria gripped the steering wheel tighter. Busy. Rain check. The words played in her mind over and over until she wanted to scream. Instead, she pulled off the freeway and parked in an empty lot behind a closed pharmacy. The rain tapped against the roof of the car. Victoria bent forward and covered her face with both hands. For a long time, she cried, not because Graham had disappointed her again. That part no longer surprised her. She cried because she finally understood what this was costing. Not just her marriage, not just her heart, her child, the tiny life inside her that had done nothing except exist and already deserved better than this. "I'm sorry," she whispered through tears, one hand over her stomach. "I'm so sorry." The rain kept falling. After a while, the crying stopped. Victoria sat up slowly. Her face hurt. Her eyes burned. But something had changed. The doctor's words stayed with her. You could lose the pregnancy. No, she thought. She had already spent too long protecting Graham from the consequences of who he had become. Now she needed to protect herself. And her baby. By the time she got home, the house was empty. Graham had not come back yet. Victoria walked upstairs to the small office off the bedroom. At the back of the closet was a locked drawer. She unlocked it with a key she kept hidden inside an old jewelry box. Inside was everything. Bank statements, screenshots, copies of messages, hotel reservations, apartment payments, receipts from Cartier, the Miami trip, the Aspen trip. Every lie Graham had told sat quietly inside that drawer waiting to be seen. Victoria carried the stack of papers to the desk. Then she pulled out one more folder. Thicker, older, the Sterling Global folder. She opened it slowly. Inside were the original company papers from years ago. The first emergency contracts. The agreements from when the company had almost collapsed. Back then, Graham had been desperate. Banks said no. investors walked away. He had stood in the kitchen with both hands on the counter and told her he thought he was going to lose everything. Victoria remembered taking off her grandfather's old ring and placing it on the table. "If I help you," she had asked, "will you trust me?" He had looked at her like she was the only good thing left in his life. Yes. He signed every paper she put in front of him, because he trusted her, because he loved her, or because he never believed she would use her power. Victoria turned to the last page. There it was, 70% ownership. Her name, not his. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. A small smile, not because she was happy, because she was no longer afraid. Victoria reached for her phone. First, she called her lawyer. Then she called the private investigator. When both calls were finished, she sat alone in the quiet house and looked down at the papers spread across the desk. "Tell me honestly in the comments," she said softly, as if speaking to someone sitting beside her. "If you were Victoria, would you leave quietly? Or would you make sure the truth came out?" Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside, Victoria closed the folder, rested her hand over her stomach, and smiled again. This time, it looked a little more like strength. The company gala was 3 nights later. Graham told her over breakfast. "Friday night," he said, without looking up from his phone. 7 o'clock. Downtown. Victoria poured herself coffee. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you're expected to be there." She looked at him across the kitchen island. The same man who had missed doctor appointments, ignored her calls, and brought Vanessa into their house now suddenly cared whether she appeared beside him in public. Of course he did. The gala was not about marriage. It was about appearances. Investors would be there, reporters, business partners. Every rich person in Houston who liked pretending money made them important. Graham finally looked up. "Try not to make a scene." Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. "You should take your own advice." For the first time in days, he looked uncertain, only for a second. Then he picked up his phone and left the room. Victoria stood alone in the kitchen after he walked away. She knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted her there because he wanted control. He wanted people to see her standing quietly beside him while he walked in with Vanessa later. He wanted her embarrassed, small. He wanted to prove that no matter what he did, she would stay. He had no idea how wrong he was. Friday evening, Victoria stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom. She wore a deep emerald dress that rested softly over the curve of her stomach. 3 months pregnant now, though still small enough that only she noticed. Her curls fell over one shoulder. Diamond earrings caught the light. Her makeup was simple. She looked elegant, strong, like a woman who remembered exactly who she was. Behind her, Graham stepped out of the closet, adjusting his cufflinks. When he saw her, he stopped. For one long second, he simply stared. Victoria saw something flicker in his face. The old Graham, the man who used to look at her like she was the most beautiful woman in any room. Then it disappeared. "You're wearing that?" he asked. Victoria picked up her purse. "Why? You think I look too much like your wife?" His jaw tightened. Neither of them spoke again during the drive downtown. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and soft gold lighting. Waiters carried champagne through the room. A jazz band played near the stage. The room smelled like expensive perfume and money. Victoria stepped inside beside Graham and immediately felt it. The whispers, the sideways glances. People knew something. Not everything, but enough. A woman near the bar looked from Victoria to Graham and then quickly away. 2 men standing near the windows stopped talking when she walked past. Houston loved gossip almost as much as it loved pretending to be respectable. Victoria kept her head high. If people wanted to stare, let them. She stood near one of the tall windows overlooking downtown and took a slow breath. For a little while, things stayed quiet. Then the room changed. Victoria did not even need to turn around. She could feel it. The shift, the way conversations softened, the way people suddenly became interested in nothing at all. Vanessa had arrived. Victoria turned slowly. Vanessa walked through the ballroom, wearing red. Of course she was wearing red. The dress was tight, bright, impossible to ignore. And she was on Graham's arm. He had gone to get another drink 5 minutes earlier. Now there he was beside Vanessa, like he had forgotten he came with his wife. A few people stared openly. Vanessa smiled when she saw Victoria. Not nervous, not embarrassed, proud. She walked directly toward her. "Victoria," she said sweetly, "you came." Victoria looked at her calmly. "You sound surprised." Vanessa glanced down at her dress. "I just thought you might not want to see this." "This?" Vanessa slipped her hand around Graham's arm. Victoria looked at Graham. He said nothing. Of course he said nothing. Vanessa smiled again. "I know this must be difficult for you." Victoria looked her up and down. "No," she said quietly. "Difficult is building a life with someone and discovering he was never the man you thought he was." Vanessa's smile slipped. Around them, people pretended not to listen. They listened. Every word. Vanessa recovered quickly. "Well," she said, "at least now everyone can stop pretending." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You should be careful." "About what?" "About confusing attention with love." For the first time, Vanessa looked uncertain. Graham stepped between them. "That's enough." Victoria looked at him. "No," she said. "You don't get to tell me when enough is." He leaned closer. "You're embarrassing yourself." Victoria laughed softly. The sound made him angrier. "Graham," she said, "you brought your mistress to a company event while your pregnant wife is standing 10 feet away. If somebody looks embarrassing tonight, it won't be me." His face went hard. He turned away and headed toward the bar. Vanessa followed him. Victoria stood still for a moment. Then she placed one hand gently over her stomach. The baby moved. Or maybe she imagined it. Either way, it reminded her why she was there. Not for Graham, for herself. An hour later, the room had grown louder. Champagne, music, too many people pretending not to watch. Graham had been drinking. Victoria could see it in the way he moved, in the way his voice carried too far across the room. Vanessa stood beside him, laughing too loudly at things that were not funny. Victoria stayed near the windows. She was ready to leave. Then Graham walked toward her. Vanessa beside him. There was something reckless in his face now, the kind of expression people wear right before they ruin their own lives. "You think you're better than everyone," he said. Victoria looked at him calmly. "No, I think I deserved better than this." He stepped closer. "You've been making things difficult." "No," she said. "I've been making you uncomfortable." Vanessa crossed her arms. "You know what your problem is?" She said to Victoria, "You still think you matter." The room went very quiet. Victoria looked at her, then at Graham. He did not defend her. He did not stop Vanessa. Instead, he smiled, small, cruel. Then he looked directly at Victoria and said the words that would destroy everything. "If you want to stay in my world," he said slowly, "you should learn your place." Victoria felt something inside her go completely still. "And where is that?" she asked. Graham looked at Vanessa, then back at Victoria, and in front of the room full of people, he pointed toward the floor. "Kneel." The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa looked shocked. Victoria stared at him. For 1 second, she saw every version of him at once. The young man who danced with her in the kitchen, the husband who held her hand, the man sitting in front of her now with liquor on his breath, and another woman at his side. The old Graham was gone. This was someone else. "Kneel in front of her," Graham said again, lower this time. Right now, the silence hurt. Victoria looked around the room. People were watching. Investors, executives, friends, strangers. Nobody said a word. Good, she thought. Watch him. Slowly, Victoria bent down, not because he had power over her, because she wanted every person in that room to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Her knees touched the floor. Someone gasped. Vanessa stepped back. Graham's face changed, only slightly, as if some part of him had not believed she would do it. Victoria looked up at him from the marble floor, and suddenly the room tilted, the lights blurred. Her chest tightened. One hand flew to her stomach. No. The last thing she heard was somebody screaming her name. Then, everything went black. The second Victoria collapsed, the ballroom exploded. Someone screamed. A glass shattered against the marble floor. People rushed toward her from every direction. Victoria could hear voices, but they sounded far away, muffled, like she was underwater. Her cheek pressed against the cold floor. One hand covered her stomach. No. Please, no. Victoria. Graham dropped to his knees beside her. For the first time all night, his voice sounded afraid, really afraid. He touched her shoulder. Victoria, look at me. She could not. The room spun. A woman somewhere behind them said, "She's pregnant." Everything stopped. The words moved through the crowd like electricity. Pregnant. Vanessa stepped backward so quickly, she nearly lost her balance. Her face had gone completely pale. "She's what?" she whispered. Nobody answered her. 2 men from the hotel staff rushed forward. Someone called 911. Graham kept saying Victoria's name like if he said it enough times, he could pull her back into the room and erase what he had done. But it was too late for that. By the time the ambulance arrived, Victoria was barely conscious. Bright lights flashed across the ballroom windows. The paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. Graham followed them all the way to the elevator. "I'm coming with her." One of the paramedics looked at him briefly. "Are you her husband?" "Yes." The paramedic glanced at Victoria, lying pale and still on the stretcher. Then back at Graham. "She doesn't seem very safe with you." The words hit harder than Graham expected. For a second, he just stood there. Then the elevator doors closed. The ambulance ride passed in pieces. Victoria heard sirens, voices, the sound of someone saying her blood pressure was too high. Another voice telling her to stay awake. She tried. She tried because there was only one thing that mattered now, the baby. At the hospital, nurses rushed her through the emergency doors. Graham ran behind them. "I need to be with her." A nurse stepped in front of him. "No, she's my wife. She needs treatment. I'm going in there." "No, you're not." Her voice was sharp enough to stop him. "You can wait." Graham stared through the small glass window in the doors as doctors and nurses moved around Victoria's bed. Machines beeped. People spoke too quickly to understand. He had never felt helpless before, not like this. He had spent his whole life believing money could fix anything. A better lawyer, a better doctor, a bigger house, a more expensive apology. But there was nothing he could buy in that waiting room. 2 hours passed, then 3. Graham sat alone under harsh white lights, with dried champagne still on one sleeve. His phone buzzed again and again. Calls from reporters, messages from business partners, a text from Vanessa. What is happening? He stared at the screen, then turned the phone face down. For once, Vanessa was the last thing on his mind. Finally, the doctor walked into the waiting room. Graham stood immediately. "How is she?" The doctor looked exhausted, but his eyes were cold. "She and the baby are alive." Graham closed his eyes briefly. "Thank God." Then the doctor added, "Barely." The word stayed in the air between them. "Barely. What happened?" Graham asked. The doctor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "What happened is that your wife is under severe emotional stress." Graham said nothing. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. She's been stressed lately." The doctor stared at him. "Your wife collapsed after being publicly humiliated while pregnant." Graham looked away. There were witnesses. The doctor stepped closer. "I am putting this in her medical file." Graham frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like." The doctor's voice became harder. "Emotional abuse during pregnancy can put both mother and child at risk." Graham felt something cold move through his chest. "Is the baby okay?" For now, not forever, not safe. For now." The doctor looked at him one last time. "She needs peace. If she keeps living like this, she could lose the baby." Then he walked away. Graham sat back down slowly. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who had no idea what to do. The next morning, Victoria woke to sunlight pressing through the hospital blinds. Her body ached. Her throat felt dry. She moved one hand slowly toward her stomach. Still there. Still okay. She closed her eyes. Thank God. Then she heard a chair move. Victoria looked up. Graham sat beside the window. His tie was gone. His shirt was wrinkled. He looked terrible. Good. The second she saw him, everything came back. The ballroom, Vanessa, the floor, Neil. Victoria's face went cold. "Get out." Graham stood quickly. "Victoria, please, get out. I need to explain. There is nothing left to explain." His eyes filled with panic. "I was angry. You were cruel. I didn't mean it. Victoria looked at him in disbelief. You pointed at the floor and told your pregnant wife to kneel in front of your mistress. He flinched at the word. Mistress, you brought her into my house, Victoria said quietly. You ignored me. You lied to me. And when I finally stopped pretending everything was fine, you tried to humiliate me. Victoria. No. Her voice stayed calm. That was what frightened him. There were no tears now. No shaking. Just the truth. You almost killed our child. He looked down. For a second, he looked like he might cry. But Victoria did not care. Because finally, after months of feeling small, she understood something. Graham had spent so long believing he was untouchable that he never imagined the day would come when she stopped loving him more than she loved herself. Victoria sat up slowly in the bed. Every movement hurt, but she kept her eyes on him. I know about the money, she said. His head lifted. The apartment, the jewelry, Miami, Aspen. He went still. And I know exactly where you took it from. Victoria, listen to me. No. You listen. She folded her hands gently over her stomach. Then she looked at him with a calm that made his face lose color. I am going to destroy you. The room went silent. Not because she raised her voice, because she did not. She said it the way people say things they have already decided. Graham stared at her. For the first time since she met him, he looked afraid of her. Real fear. The kind people feel when they finally realize they are standing on the wrong side of the story. Victoria pointed toward the door. Get out. This time, he listened. He walked out of the hospital room slowly. At the doorway, he looked back once. Victoria had already turned away from him. He left anyway. And for the first time in his life, Graham understood what it felt like to lose. 2 weeks later, Victoria filed for divorce. By lunchtime, all of Houston knew. The story spread through the city faster than a summer storm. At brunch tables in River Oaks, women leaned closer over mimosas and lowered their voices. At church after Sunday service, people stood in the parking lot talking longer than usual. At beauty salons, women shook their heads while somebody sat under a dryer pretending not to listen. Even in business circles, where people usually protected rich men no matter what they did, the mood had changed. Because everyone had heard the same detail. The pregnant wife, the gala, the floor, the word, kneel. Nobody could get past that. Victoria did not leave the house much during those first days. She stayed in the guest room of her aunt's house on the west side of Houston. The room smelled like lavender and clean laundry. Her aunt left food outside the door when Victoria did not feel like talking. Greens, rice, peach cobbler, the kind of meals made by people who know they cannot fix your pain, but refuse to let you sit with it hungry. Some nights, Victoria sat on the edge of the bed with one hand over her stomach and listened to her family downstairs. Laughter, dishes, a football game, too loud on television. It reminded her of who she was before Graham. That helped. The first time she saw the story online, she almost closed her phone. Then she read it. Billionaire humiliates pregnant wife at gala. Another article called Graham a disgrace. Someone had leaked a photo from the ballroom. Not the moment he pointed, not the moment she fell. The moment right before, Victoria standing there in her green dress. Vanessa, beside Graham in red. Graham looking angry, Victoria looking calm. The comments below were brutal. Nobody defended him. Not really. Even the people trying to excuse him sounded weak. Stress, marriage problems, misunderstanding. No, people knew what they saw. Meanwhile, Graham spent every day trying to control the damage. He gave one interview to a local business magazine. He sat in a dark suit and told the reporter the situation had been deeply personal and taken out of context. He said he and Victoria were going through a difficult time. He called the collapse an unfortunate misunderstanding. The article made everything worse, because by then, people were tired of hearing powerful men explain bad behavior like it was weather. Graham also tried to save himself at work. He called meetings at Sterling Global. He walked through the building, acting like nothing had changed, but people looked at him differently now. A woman at the front desk who used to smile at him barely spoke. One of the executives canceled lunch with him. 2 investors asked to postpone a meeting. He still had his office, still had his title, but the room had shifted. People could smell weakness, and for the first time in years, Graham looked weak. Vanessa noticed too. 3 days after the divorce papers were filed, she showed up at Graham's apartment, furious. "You said this would blow over." Graham loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. "It will." "No, it won't." She stood in the middle of the room with her arms crossed. "You didn't tell me she was pregnant." "I didn't know." "You didn't tell me she was part owner of the company either." Graham looked up sharply. "What?" Vanessa stared at him. "People are talking." For a second, something flickered across his face. Then it disappeared. "She doesn't own anything." But the confidence was gone. Vanessa saw it, the same way Victoria had seen it. The tiny crack in the man who always acted untouchable. "You said I didn't have to worry," Vanessa said quietly. Graham did not answer, because, suddenly, he was not sure. Across town, Victoria sat in a lawyer's office with a stack of folders spread across the table. The room smelled like coffee and paper. Outside the window, traffic moved slowly through downtown. Inside, everything was quiet, except for the turning of pages. Victoria sat straight-backed in a cream sweater and dark jeans. Her pregnancy showed a little more now, not enough for strangers to notice, enough for her to. Her lawyer slid another document toward her. "Hotel charges in Miami," he said. Victoria nodded. "Company card." Another paper. "Aspen." Another. "The apartment." Another. "Jewelry." The stack grew higher. Victoria looked at every page, every transfer, every lie, every dollar Graham had spent trying to impress Vanessa with money that was not really his. Then came the hospital report. Victoria read it once, then again. Patient admitted following severe emotional distress during pregnancy. Blood pressure dangerously elevated. Risk to pregnancy. Witnesses confirmed public humiliation immediately before collapse. Victoria put the paper down. For a moment, she could not speak, because seeing pain written down made it feel different somehow. More real. Her lawyer looked at her carefully. "You don't have to go through with this if you're not ready." Victoria looked up. For the first time in weeks, she knew exactly how she felt. "I am ready." And she was, not because she wanted revenge, because she finally understood something. For months, she had been grieving a marriage that only existed in her memory. The man she loved was gone long before Vanessa arrived. She had spent too much time hoping if she loved him enough, waited long enough, forgave enough, he would become himself again. But there was no version of Graham left to save, only herself and her child. Victoria took a slow breath. Then she opened the last folder, the company folder, the old contracts, the signatures, the ownership agreement, 70%. Still there, still hers. She looked at her lawyer. "When do we file this?" His expression changed. "Court hearing is next Thursday." Victoria closed the folder carefully. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, something in her finally settled. The night before the hearing, she stood in front of the mirror buttoning her coat. Her aunt stood in the doorway behind her. "You sure?" her aunt asked softly. Victoria looked at herself one last time. Then she nodded. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm done being afraid." The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras. Reporters waited outside. People whispered when Victoria walked past. She kept her head high. One hand rested lightly over her stomach. The other held the folder. When the courthouse doors opened, Victoria walked inside. And for the first time since the night everything broke, she was not walking in as Graham's wife. She was walking in as the woman who was about to take her life back. The courtroom was already full when Victoria walked in. Reporters filled the back rows. People from Sterling Global sat near the front, pretending they were there for legal reasons and not because nobody in Houston wanted to miss this. Victoria walked slowly toward her seat. She wore a soft cream dress beneath a long coat. Her hair fell neatly over her shoulders. Her pregnancy showed a little more now. She looked calm. That was what people noticed first. Not broken, not angry, calm. Across the room, Graham sat beside his lawyer in a dark suit that suddenly looked too expensive for the moment. Vanessa sat one row behind him, wearing sunglasses and a white coat, even though they were inside. Victoria almost laughed. Vanessa still thought appearances could save her. The courtroom doors closed. Then the judge entered, an older woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of voice that made people sit up before she even spoke. Everyone stood, then sat again. Graham's lawyer spoke first. He smiled too much. He called the marriage complicated. He called the affair a personal matter. Then he looked directly at Victoria. My client believes Mrs. Sterling has been acting emotionally due to stress and pregnancy. Victoria did not react. Mrs. Sterling has become unstable, he continued. She has exaggerated several events in an effort to punish her husband. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Graham stared straight ahead. His lawyer kept going. The collapse at the gala, while unfortunate, has been misunderstood. Victoria folded her hands quietly over her stomach. Her lawyer did not move until the room fell silent. Then he stood. Your Honor, he said calmly, before we discuss misunderstandings, I think the court should understand who actually owns Sterling Global. He placed a folder on the judge's desk. The judge adjusted her glasses and opened it. She read the first page, then the second. Then she looked up at Graham. What is this? For the first time all morning, Graham looked confused. Victoria did not. The judge looked back down at the papers. These documents show that Victoria Sterling owns 70% of Sterling Global. The courtroom exploded. A woman in the back gasped out loud. Vanessa sat up so fast she nearly dropped her purse. Graham turned toward Victoria. What? Victoria met his eyes. You forgot. His face went completely still. Years ago, the loans, the emergency contracts, the papers he signed without reading because he trusted her, or because he never imagined she would matter enough to protect herself. The judge looked at Graham again. According to these documents, you transferred majority ownership to your wife in exchange for financial backing and legal protection during the company's early years. That's impossible, Graham said. No, Victoria answered quietly. It's inconvenient. A few people looked down to hide their reactions. The judge continued reading. Then another folder landed on her desk. Bank statements, hotel charges, apartment payments, private flights, jewelry, every dollar Graham spent on Vanessa using company money. The judge's mouth tightened. These expenses came from Sterling Global accounts? Victoria's lawyer nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Graham's lawyer stood quickly. There may be an explanation for those transactions. There is, Victoria said. The room turned toward her. He stole from the company to impress his mistress. Vanessa looked at Graham. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not of Victoria, of him, because now she understood something. The man she chose was not powerful. He was careless. The judge flipped through the pages. Miami, she said. Another page. Aspen. Another apartment lease. Another Cartier. Every word hit Graham harder than the last. Then came the final folder. The hospital records. The courtroom became completely silent. The judge read slowly. Patient admitted after collapse caused by severe emotional distress during pregnancy. Nobody moved. The judge continued. Witnesses confirm Mrs. Sterling was publicly humiliated immediately before the collapse. She looked directly at Graham. What happened at the gala? Graham swallowed. His lawyer stood again. Your Honor, emotions were high that evening. That is not what I asked. The judge's voice cut through the room. She looked at Graham. Did you order your pregnant wife to kneel in front of another woman? The silence lasted forever. Vanessa looked down. Graham stared at the desk. The judge waited. Finally, quietly, he answered, Yes. No one in the courtroom made a sound. The truth sat there between them. Ugly, heavy, impossible to explain away. The judge leaned back in her chair. What you did, she said slowly, was cruel. Graham looked down, reckless. He closed his eyes. Abusive. Vanessa removed her sunglasses. She looked pale. The judge looked at Victoria, then back at Graham. You ignored your wife during a vulnerable pregnancy. You misused company funds. You humiliated her publicly. She closed the file. And frankly, Mr. Sterling, you should be ashamed of yourself. Graham had no answer, because there was nothing left to say. The judge lifted the final document. Victoria Sterling retains full controlling interest in Sterling Global. Graham looked up sharply. No. You will step down immediately from all executive positions. No, wait. You will surrender the marital home, all shared accounts, and every asset purchased through company funds. Vanessa turned toward him in disbelief. You said this couldn't happen, she whispered. Graham did not answer. He could not. The judge continued, "You will also provide financial support for the child." Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. Then the judge looked at another paper. Her expression changed. "Children." The room froze. Graham looked up. "What?" The judge looked at Victoria. "Mrs. Sterling is expecting twins." For 1 second, nobody moved. Twins. The word echoed through the room. Vanessa stared at Graham. Graham stared at Victoria. Victoria placed one hand gently over her stomach. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said softly. "Twins." Something broke in his face. Not because he suddenly loved her enough, because for the first time, he understood exactly what he had thrown away. The judge's voice brought the room back. Based on witness testimony, medical records, and the emotional risk to the children, this court grants Victoria primary custody. The sound in the courtroom changed. Whispers, shocked voices, reporters scribbling notes. Victoria sat perfectly still. No smile, no victory, only peace. Because the fight was over. Across the room, Graham sat frozen in his chair, while every person in the courtroom looked at him the same way, like a man who had destroyed his own life with his own hands. By the time Graham stepped outside the courthouse, the cameras were waiting. "Mr. Sterling, did you know your wife owned the company? Did you really force her to kneel? Is it true she's having twins?" The questions came from every direction. Flashbulbs lit up his face. For years, Graham had walked past reporters with that same expression. Calm, confident, the look of a man who believed he would always win. That look was gone now. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps, staring down at the crowd like he did not know where to go. Vanessa came out a few seconds later. The second the reporters saw her, the shouting got louder. "Vanessa, did you know he was using company money on you? Are you still together? How do you feel about the twins?" Vanessa froze. Then she looked at Graham. For a second, he expected her to move closer, to take his hand, to stand beside him the way Victoria once would have. Instead, Vanessa stepped away. "Vanessa," Graham said. She would not look at him. One of the reporters moved closer. "Did you know he lied to you too?" Vanessa pulled her sunglasses down over her face. Then she turned and hurried toward the parking lot. "Vanessa." She kept walking. By the time Graham reached the curb, she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no promise to call. Just gone. For a long moment, Graham stood there in front of the courthouse, with cameras pointed at him, and nobody beside him. Then he got into the back of a car and told the driver to take him anywhere. The hotel room was small, too small. The carpet smelled like old smoke. The television hung crooked on the wall. The bedspread had tiny brown patterns on it that looked like they had not changed since the 90s. Graham sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the room. 3 weeks ago, he had a penthouse, a private driver, a company, a wife who loved him. Now he had room 417 in a hotel near the freeway and a paper cup of bad coffee sitting beside the television. His phone buzzed once. He looked down. No message from Vanessa, only another news alert. Sterling Global CEO removed after courtroom shocker. He turned the phone face down. Silence filled the room. That was the part he could not escape. For years, his life had been full of noise. Meetings, phones, parties, business dinners, women laughing too hard at things that were not funny because he was paying for the table. Now there was nothing. No one called. The men who used to tell him he was brilliant suddenly had other plans. The people who used to crowd around him at charity events did not answer his messages. Even the people at work kept their distance, because money attracts people. Power attracts people. But when both disappear, the truth arrives. And the truth was simple. Nobody had ever really loved him, except Victoria. Across town, Victoria stood in the kitchen of her new house. It was smaller than the old one. Smaller kitchen, smaller windows, smaller backyard, but it felt warmer. There were flowers on the table. Music coming softly from the living room, a candle burning near the sink. The house smelled like cinnamon and cornbread. Her aunt stood at the stove stirring greens while 2 of Victoria's cousins argued over which old song should play next. "Absolutely not," her aunt said. "Nobody wants to hear that." "Yes, they do." "No, they do not." Victoria laughed. The sound surprised her, because she had not heard herself laugh like that in a very long time. On Sundays, The house filled up. Church clothes, loud voices, people carrying too many containers of food. Her aunt always brought sweet tea. Her cousins always arrived late. Somebody always forgot the ice. The television played in one room, while music played in another. The kind of family gathering where everybody talks at the same time and nobody cares. Victoria sat at the table one Sunday afternoon with a plate in front of her and one hand resting on her stomach. Her aunt looked over at her. "You need anything?" Victoria smiled softly. "I'm okay." And for once, it was true. Not completely. Not every day. Some nights, she still cried after everyone left. Healing was not neat. There were still moments when she missed the man Graham used to be, the version of him from years ago, the one who danced with her in the kitchen, the one who held her hand in waiting rooms and kissed her forehead in the middle of the night. But those moments passed faster now, because every time she thought about the man she lost, she remembered the man who stood in that ballroom and pointed at the floor. That was the truth too. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, Victoria stepped onto the back porch. The air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. She wrapped a blanket around herself and lowered one hand to her stomach. The twins moved beneath her hand. Small, gentle, alive. Victoria smiled through tears. Everything had changed because of them. Everything. If she had not been pregnant, maybe she would have stayed longer. Maybe she would have kept making excuses. Maybe she would have kept waiting for Graham to become someone he no longer was. But now, there was no room for that. She had to be brave for them. Victoria closed her eyes. Then she whispered softly into the night, "You saved me." The flowers arrived on a Tuesday morning, white roses. Victoria stared at them from the doorway, while her aunt carried the box into the kitchen. "No name?" Her aunt asked. Victoria already knew. She opened the small card tucked between the flowers. "I'm sorry. Please talk to me. Graham." She looked at the roses for a long moment. Then she closed the card and handed it back. "Throw them away." Her aunt raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Victoria nodded. "They smell like guilt." The next day, a letter came. Then another. Then another. The first one was 6 pages long. Victoria never opened it. She dropped it into the trash beside the kitchen counter while her cousins argued in the living room about what to order for dinner. The second one arrived 3 days later, shorter. The third came the week after that. Each envelope looked more desperate than the last. Victoria left them all unopened. Then came the texts. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. Please let me explain. I miss you. I made a mistake." The last message sat on her screen for almost a minute. "I still love you." Victoria stared at it. Then she put the phone down and went back to folding baby clothes. Because the truth was, Graham did not miss her. He missed who he was when she loved him. A few weeks later, Victoria returned to Sterling Global for the first time since the trial. Her company now. Her building. The name still said Sterling Global in silver letters across the front of the building. But the place felt different. The lobby was quieter. People stood straighter when she walked in, not because they feared her, because they respected her. The receptionist smiled when she saw her. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." Victoria smiled back. "Morning." As she walked through the lobby, employees nodded. One woman stopped her near the elevator. "I just wanted to say." The woman hesitated. "You handled everything with a lot of grace." Victoria thanked her softly. The elevator doors opened. By the time she finished her meeting upstairs, the sky outside had turned gray. Rain clouds gathered over downtown Houston. Victoria stepped out of the building and stopped. Graham stood across the street beside a black car. For a second, she almost did not recognize him. He looked thinner. The expensive haircut had grown out. There were dark circles under his eyes. Even the way he stood had changed. Less confident, more tired. He saw her and crossed the street immediately. "Victoria." She kept walking. "Victoria, please." She stopped, not because she wanted to, because she was tired of running from conversations she already knew the ending to. Slowly, she turned around. What? For a second, Graham just looked at her. Maybe he was seeing her for the first time. The cream sweater, the dark coat, the curve of her stomach beneath it, the calm in her face. "You look good," he said quietly. Victoria almost laughed. "That's not why you're here." "No, Rain began to fall lightly around them. Cars moved past in the distance. Graham shoved his hands into his pockets. I was wrong. Victoria said nothing. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, she said. It doesn't. He looked down at the sidewalk. I ruined everything. Yes. The word landed softly. That made it worse. If she had screamed, maybe he could have argued. If she had cried, maybe he could have comforted himself by believing she still loved him. But Victoria stood there calm and steady, like someone who had already survived the worst part. Graham looked back at her. I miss you. Victoria held his gaze. No, she said quietly. You miss losing. His face tightened. That's not fair. Fair? For the first time, there was anger in her voice. Fair was sitting alone at doctor appointments while you were buying another woman jewelry. He looked away. Fair was carrying your children while you brought your mistress into my house. Victoria. Fair was me standing in that ballroom while you pointed at the floor. The rain came down a little harder. Graham looked like he wanted to disappear. I know, he said. I know what I did. No, Victoria said softly. You know what it cost you. He stared at her. There it was, the truth. Because if he still had the house, the company, the money, and the attention, he would never be standing outside in the rain begging her to talk to him. He missed her now because she was the only thing in his life that had ever been real, and he lost her. You only started loving me again after you lost everything, Victoria said. I never stopped. Yes, you did. The words came out so quietly they almost hurt more. You stopped the first time you looked at me and saw someone you could hurt. Graham looked down. The rain slid through his hair and onto his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he whispered, Do you hate me? Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she shook her head. No. His eyes lifted. I don't hate you. For 1 second, hope flashed across his face. Then she finished. I just see you clearly now. The hope disappeared, because that was worse. Worse than anger. Worse than hate. Victoria looked at him one last time. There was a time she would have done anything to save him. Now she finally understood something. Some people do not need to be saved. They need to live with what they chose. Before we get to what happened the night the babies were born, subscribe if you believe some people only understand your worth after they lose you. Victoria adjusted her coat and stepped past him. Take care of yourself, Graham, she said quietly. Then she walked away. He stood in the rain and watched her go. This time, he knew she was never coming back. The twins came early. It happened just after 2 a.m. Victoria woke to a sharp pain low in her stomach. At first, she stayed still in bed, one hand resting over the blankets. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she had slept wrong. Then another pain hit, stronger this time. Victoria sat up slowly. The house was dark and quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. For one strange second, she almost reached for the other side of the bed. The old habit, the old life. Then she remembered. There was nobody there. Victoria swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. Another pain. She grabbed the edge of the dresser and closed her eyes. Okay, she whispered to herself. Okay. A few minutes later, every light in the house was on. Her aunt moved through the kitchen in slippers and a robe, throwing things into a bag, while Victoria leaned against the counter, breathing through the pain. Her cousins hurried down the stairs half awake and completely panicked. Do we call somebody? We are somebody. Where are the keys? Why is nobody wearing shoes? Victoria laughed in spite of herself. Then another contraction came, and she gripped the kitchen counter so hard, her knuckles turned white. Her aunt was beside her immediately. Breathe, baby. By the time they reached the hospital, the sky outside was still black. The waiting room looked different at that hour. Too bright. Too quiet. Nurses moved quickly through the hallways, while Victoria sat in a wheelchair gripping the sides and trying not to cry. Not from fear, from exhaustion. The contractions kept coming. Fast. Too fast. Inside the delivery room, everything happened at once. Machines, voices, hands. A nurse helped her breathe. Another adjusted the monitors. Her aunt stood beside the bed, holding one hand, while one of her cousins held the other. You're okay, her aunt kept saying. You're okay. Victoria wanted to believe her, but every time the pain came, it felt like her body was splitting apart. For a second between contractions, Victoria looked toward the corner of the room. There was an empty chair. A simple chair beside the window, the place where Graham should have been. The thought hurt more than she expected, not because she wanted him there, because once there had been a version of her life where he would have been. He would have held her hand. He would have kissed her forehead. He would have looked terrified and excited all at once. That man was gone. And suddenly, Victoria was grateful, because the woman she had become no longer needed him to survive. Hours passed. The sky outside the hospital window slowly turned from black to dark blue, then gray, then the first pale light of morning. Victoria cried out and gripped her aunt's hand. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," her aunt said immediately. "You already are." The room blurred through tears. Then, one final push. A cry filled the room, loud, sharp, beautiful. Victoria looked up. The nurse was smiling. "It's a girl." Victoria covered her mouth with one hand and started crying immediately. Before she could even catch her breath, another contraction hit. Another push. Another cry. "It's a boy." The room exploded with laughter and tears and voices all at once. Victoria leaned back against the pillows, exhausted. The nurse placed the little girl carefully in her arms. A few seconds later, the little boy beside her. They were tiny, warm, perfect. The little girl opened her mouth in a small yawn. The little boy made a soft sound and curled one hand into a fist. Victoria looked down at them, and everything inside her broke open. All the pain, all the nights she cried alone, all the humiliation, all the fear. It suddenly felt smaller, because now she had them. "You're here," she whispered through tears. "You're here." Later that afternoon, while the babies slept in clear bassinets near the bed, someone knocked softly at the hospital door. Victoria looked up. Graham stood there. For 1 second, nobody moved. He looked worse than the last time she saw him. Pale, exhausted, his shirt wrinkled, his hair damp from the rain outside. He looked at Victoria first, then at the babies, and his face changed. "Oh my God," he whispered. Victoria said nothing. Graham stepped into the room slowly, like he was afraid somebody would tell him to leave. Maybe he expected Victoria to. Maybe he deserved it. "I heard," he said quietly. Victoria looked back down at the twins. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." He stood there for a moment. Then his voice cracked. "Please." The room stayed silent. Her aunt looked at Victoria, but said nothing, because this choice belonged to her. Victoria looked at Graham, then at the twins, then back at Graham. He looked nothing like the man who stood in the ballroom, nothing like the man who pointed at the floor. He looked like a man finally seeing the damage after the fire was already over. "Come in," she said softly. He moved closer to the bed, slowly, carefully. The little girl stirred in Victoria's arms. The little boy slept beside her. Graham looked down at them and started crying. Real tears. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind that come when there is nothing left to hide behind. "They're beautiful," he whispered. Victoria looked at the babies. "Yes," she said. "They are." He reached out one hand, then stopped halfway, like he was afraid to touch them. "You can hold him," Victoria said quietly. Graham looked up in surprise. Then the nurse gently lifted the little boy and placed him into his arms. For a second, Graham froze. The little boy fit against his chest so easily, it almost looked painful. Graham looked down and cried harder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Victoria watched him. Part of her wanted to look away. Another part remembered that once, long ago, she would have loved this version of him. The version who finally understood, but understanding had come too late. Graham looked up at her. "I know I can't fix this." "No," Victoria said softly. "You can't." He closed his eyes. "But these are your children." His eyes opened again. Victoria folded the blanket more carefully around the little girl. "If you want to be their father, then be their father." Hope flickered across his face. Small, fragile. Then she finished, "But you will never be my husband again." The hope remained for the twins, but not for her. Graham lowered his head, because finally he understood the difference. 5 years later, Victoria's house looked nothing like the old penthouse. There were toys in the living room, tiny shoes by the front door, finger paintings taped to the refrigerator. The couch had a stain on one arm from grape juice that nobody could get out. Victoria loved every bit of it. On Saturday mornings, the twins woke up too early. They climbed into her bed before sunrise, carrying blankets and stuffed animals and questions that made no sense before coffee. Can turtles blink? Why do pancakes smell different than waffles? Who would win in a fight, a lion or a shark? Victoria laughed and pulled both of them under the blankets beside her. The little girl always talked first. The little boy listened longer. Then both of them started arguing over cartoons before Victoria even got out of bed. By 8 o'clock, the house smelled like pancakes. Music played softly in the kitchen, while Victoria stood at the stove wearing pajamas and fuzzy socks. The twins sat at the table coloring with crayons. The little girl liked purple. The little boy liked blue. Every now and then, they both looked up at the same time and started talking over each other. Victoria smiled. This was the life she used to think she wanted with Graham. Turns out, she built something better without him. Sterling Global still belonged to her. The company had grown, but Victoria ran it differently now. She left the office before dark. She never missed school programs. She never answered work calls during dinner, because she had learned something expensive. Success means nothing if the people you love are hurting while you chase it. Some afternoons, after she picked up the twins from school, they drove across Houston with the windows down and old songs playing through the car speakers. The twins sang the wrong words loudly and proudly. Victoria let them. Sometimes they stopped for barbecue on the south side. The little boy always got sauce on his shirt. The little girl always stole fries off Victoria's plate and then pretended she did not. On Sundays, the house still filled with family. Her aunt came over after church. Her cousins brought food and noise and too many opinions. The twins ran through the house laughing, while somebody in the kitchen argued over whether the cornbread needed more sugar. The house felt full, warm, alive. Sometimes, usually late at night after the twins were asleep, Victoria stood in the doorway of their bedroom and watched them sleep. The little girl curled up on her side. The little boy sprawled across the bed like he was trying to take up all the space in the world. Victoria would stand there quietly and think about the woman she used to be. The woman standing in front of that penthouse window, wondering why she was not enough. She wished she could go back and hug that version of herself. Tell her to stop begging. Tell her she would survive. Tell her that one day she would wake up in a house full of laughter and realize she had been enough all along. Graham saw the twins every weekend. At first, it had been difficult. The twins were young enough to know he was their father, but old enough to feel the distance. The little girl hid behind Victoria's legs the first time Graham came to pick them up. The little boy stood quietly beside her and refused to let go of her hand. Graham looked like somebody had hit him. "It's okay," Victoria told the twins gently, but it was not okay. Not yet. Graham tried too hard in the beginning. He showed up with expensive toys, huge stuffed animals, tablets, tiny designer clothes the twins did not even want. The little girl played with the box more than the gift inside it. The little boy asked if he could go home after an hour, because children do not care how much money you spend. They care who stays. So Graham had to learn. Slowly, painfully, he learned how to sit on the floor and build block towers for an hour without checking his phone. He learned how to make pancakes even though the first batch looked terrible. He learned how to listen when the little girl talked about school for 20 straight minutes. He learned how to braid her hair badly. The first time he tried, it looked so awful that even the little girl laughed. "You made me look like a pineapple," she said. Graham laughed too, really laughed. The little boy liked baseball, so Graham sat in the backyard with him for hours, throwing the ball back and forth. At first, the little boy barely spoke. Then, one afternoon, after months of silence and careful distance, he looked up at Graham and said, "Watch this." It was such a small thing, 2 words, but Graham smiled like somebody had handed him the world. Little by little, the twins stopped standing so far away when he arrived. The little girl started running toward him when he came to the door. The little boy asked if Graham could come to his school field day. Victoria watched all of it quietly, because this was never about her anymore. It was about them. One Sunday evening, Graham brought the twins back home after the weekend. The little girl hugged him before running inside. The little boy stood in the doorway for a second. Then he turned around. "See you next weekend," he said. Graham smiled. Yeah. The little boy hesitated. Then he ran back and hugged him too. For 1 second, Graham closed his eyes. Because after everything he destroyed, after everything he lost, the twins were beginning to love him, and he knew he had done nothing to deserve it. A few months later, the twins had their first school performance. The little girl had spent 2 weeks practicing her lines in the living room. The little boy insisted he was not nervous right up until they parked outside the school, and he nearly threw up in the back seat. Victoria laughed and fixed his collar while he stood in the parking lot pretending he did not care. You'll be fine, she told him. What if I forget everything? Then you smile and keep going. The little girl nodded seriously. That's what Mommy always does. Victoria looked at her for a second. Then she smiled. Inside, the school auditorium was already crowded. Parents filled the seats. Teachers rushed back and forth near the stage. Children in little costumes ran through the hallways with too much energy and not enough supervision. Victoria sat near the front. A few minutes later, Graham walked in. He saw her immediately. For a moment, he stopped. Victoria wore a cream sweater and dark jeans. Her curls rested softly over her shoulders. Nothing dramatic, nothing expensive. Still, she looked more beautiful than anyone else in the room. Not because of what she wore, because she looked happy, the kind of happy that comes after surviving something you thought would destroy you. Graham sat a few rows behind her, not beside her. He knew better now. The performance lasted almost an hour. The little girl forgot one of her lines and laughed at herself in the middle of the stage. The audience laughed with her. The little boy spoke so quietly during his part that only the first 2 rows heard him. Victoria clapped anyway. So did Graham. Afterward, the auditorium emptied slowly. Children ran through the crowd looking for their parents. Teachers smiled. People took too many pictures. Victoria stepped outside into the cool evening air while the twins stayed inside with their class for a few more minutes. The parking lot was nearly empty. The sky above Houston had turned deep blue. She stood beside the sidewalk with her coat wrapped around her shoulders. Then she heard his voice. Victoria. She turned. Graham stood a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He looked older now. Not old, just different. There was more gray at his temples, less pride in his face, more honesty. He looked like a man who had spent years learning things the hard way. You look happy, he said quietly. Victoria smiled a little. I am, he nodded. The silence between them felt different now. Not sharp, not painful, just real. 5 years earlier, silence between them had meant anger. Now it meant there was nothing left to fight about. Graham looked down at his hands, then back at her. I've been wanting to ask you something. Victoria waited. His voice dropped. Did you ever love me? The question hung there between them. For a second, Victoria almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything, after all these years, he still did not understand. She looked at him carefully, at the man she once would have followed anywhere, the man who broke her heart, the man who now stood in front of her, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. With everything I had, she said. He closed his eyes briefly, because he knew it was true. Victoria had loved him when he had nothing, before the company, before the money, before the suits and the cars and the people who called him important. She had loved him when all he had was an idea and too much pride. She had loved him when he was scared, when he failed, when nobody else believed in him, and he had thrown that away. Graham looked at her again. And now? Victoria looked past him toward the auditorium doors. She could hear the twins laughing inside. Then she looked back at him. Now, she said softly, I love myself more. The words hit him harder than anything else ever had, because for years, Graham had believed Victoria would always leave part of herself waiting for him. A door unlocked, a place at the table, a chance. Now he finally understood. There was no chance. There never would be, not because she hated him, because she had learned her worth. He looked down at the parking lot. The lights from the school reflected against the pavement. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Graham laughed softly to himself. One broken little laugh. What? Victoria asked. He shook his head. Nothing. But it was not nothing. He had just realized something he would carry for the rest of his life. No one would ever love him the way Victoria had. Not because she was perfect, because love like that does not come twice. Not the kind that stays when you are broke. Not the kind that believes in you before anyone else does. Not the kind that would have stood beside you through anything. He had that once, and he destroyed it. The school doors opened. The little girl came running out first. "Mommy!" The little boy was right behind her. The little girl threw herself into Victoria's arms. The little boy grabbed Graham's hand. "Did you hear me?" he asked. I remembered all my lines. "You did great," Graham said. The little boy smiled proudly. For one brief second, they all stood there together, beneath the lights outside the school. Not as husband and wife. That part was gone. But still, somehow, a family. The twins pulled them toward the parking lot, talking over each other. The little girl wanted ice cream. The little boy wanted hamburgers. Both of them wanted to explain every single thing that happened during the performance, even though Victoria and Graham had already watched the whole thing. "She forgot her line," the little boy said, pointing at his sister. "You forgot your whole song," she shot back. "I was pretending. You were not." Victoria laughed. Graham smiled quietly beside them. For a moment, it almost looked like an ordinary family, walking toward the car beneath the soft lights outside the school. But Victoria knew better. Ordinary had never been their story. When they reached the parking lot, the twins ran a few feet ahead, still arguing and laughing. Victoria stopped beside her car and looked up. The Houston sky stretched above her, dark and wide. The city lights glowed in the distance. For one second, she thought about another night, years ago. The top floor of Sterling Tower, rain against the glass, her hand over her stomach, the ache in her chest as she stood there wondering why she was not enough for the man she loved. Back then, she thought there had to be something wrong with her. Maybe she was not pretty enough, not exciting enough, not young enough. Maybe if she were softer, quieter, easier, Graham would love her the way he used to. She had spent months trying to become smaller. Smaller needs, smaller feelings, smaller pain. Because she thought love meant holding on no matter how much it hurt. She was wrong. Love should never cost you your dignity. Love should never ask you to disappear so someone else can feel important. Love should never leave you on the floor while somebody else stands above you. Victoria looked toward the twins. The little girl stood with her hands on her hips, explaining something very seriously. The little boy rolled his eyes and pretended not to listen even though he was smiling. Then she looked at Graham. He stood a few feet away watching the twins. There was sadness in his face, regret, but no anger, no excuses. Years ago, she used to think winning would mean making him hurt the way she hurt. Now she understood that real healing had nothing to do with revenge. The real victory was this. She no longer needed him to understand what he lost in order to know her own worth. Graham looked over at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled softly, a sad smile. The kind people give when they know they are looking at something they can never have back. Victoria smiled back, not because she still loved him, because she had finally forgiven herself for loving him. The little girl came running back. "Mommy, can we get ice cream?" The little boy followed behind her. "And hamburgers." Victoria laughed. "You two are impossible." "No," the little girl said proudly. "We're hungry." Graham opened the car door for them. The little boy climbed in first. The little girl stopped beside Victoria for 1 second and slipped her small hand into hers. Victoria looked down at her daughter, then at her son, then out at the city one last time. If this story reminded you that your dignity matters more than somebody else's approval, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Victoria got into the car. The twins kept talking. Graham stood beside the parking lot, watching them go, and maybe that was the lesson. Some people spend their whole lives chasing money, attention, and power because they think those things matter most. Then one day they look up and realize they traded away the one person who loved them for who they were before any of that existed. Victoria had spent years asking herself why she was not enough. She had spent years carrying a love all by herself, years making excuses for a man who stopped deserving them. But standing there beneath the Houston sky, with her children laughing in the back seat and her whole life waiting in front of her, she finally knew the truth. She had spent years asking why she was not enough. The truth was, she had always been enough. The wrong man had simply been too blind to see it. If this story touched you, Don't leave without liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs the reminder that love should never cost you your dignity. And tell me in the comments, at what moment do you think Graham truly realized he had lost Victoria forever? Subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories for more unforgettable stories about love, betrayal, strength, and second chances.